নমস্কার। রাষ্ট্রবিজ্ঞান চর্চা কেন্দ্রের আজকের আলোচনায় সবাইকে স্বাগত। আজকের আমাদের আলোচনায় আলোচক হিসেবে উপস্থিত আছেন ডক্টর রিনিতা মজুমদার। আজকের আলোচনার বিষয় হলো Aristotle Polis Rawls and Capabilities as Fundamental Entitlements। আজকে মহাশয়ার একটি সংক্ষিপ্ত পরিচিতি দিচ্ছি। সেটি হচ্ছে ডক্টর রিনিতা মজুমদার, প্রফেসর ফিলোসফি অফ অ্যান্ড কালচার স্টাডিজ, সেন্ট্রাল নিউ মেক্সিকো কমিউনিটি কলেজ, অ্যাফিলিয়েটেড প্রফেসর ওমেন স্টাডিজ, ইউনিভার্সিটি অফ নিউ মেক্সিকো। এছাড়াও মহাশয়ার অনেকগুলি গ্রন্থ রয়েছে, তার মধ্যে অন্যতম হলো উল্লেখযোগ্য হলো ইন্ট্রোডাকশন টু ফেমিনিস্ট থিওরি, ফেমিনিস্ট ইকোনমিক্স, ফেমিনিজম সেক্সুয়ালিটি, ফেমিনিস্ট থিওরিজ, আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং জেন্ডার এটসেট্রা। আমি মহাশয়াকে অনুরোধ জানাবো আজকের আলোচনা শুরু করার জন্য। ধন্যবাদ।
Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. I feel very honored. Today I am going to talk about some very basic basic theories, both in philosophy and political science, starting with Aristotle's happy polis. What it is that makes a polis or a state happy. Polis is the Aristotelian concept, and what I'm going to do is, because the subject is a little bit kind of convoluted, I won't use the word complex. I already said it's simple. So I'm going to read a paper, but I'm going to read it slowly so that others can comprehend, because if I read it too fast, then it's because one of the problems is I sometimes tend to read fast. It's going to be difficult for everyone. That is one of my problems in reading. Sometimes I go too fast. All right. Aristotle's Polis and Justice, and the individual, the Hobbes, Rousseau, Locke, Rawls, Sen, Nussbaum, Capabilities and Development. As the global human community is facing unprecedented upheavals in all aspects of human lives, social, economic, political, and psychological, we need to rethink some of the basic questions that philosophers since Aristotle has been asking. These questions are as follows. What makes a polis or a state a happy polis? What is good life? A question that both Plato and Aristotle considered central to their philosophy. What makes good life possible? What is happiness? How is happiness related to good life? How are individual rights connected to happiness? How are the notions of justice connected to happiness? Who is responsible for the general happiness of the people of polis? What is the role of the state vis-a-vis the individual in creating a happy society? In order to answer the above questions in the presentation, I'll start with the works of Aristotle in his Politics. According to Aristotle, human beings cannot live outside of associations. The smallest association in human society is the household or the oikos. Several households make up a village, and several villages make up a state or polis. The Greeks lived in city-states and not nation-states like we do. Further, each association has a function and a purpose. While the purpose of the oikos is to produce things of daily necessity and rearing of children, that of the polis is to provide the highest goal of human life, happiness or eudaimonia, which is the Greek word. Good life is a life of happiness or eudaimonia in a perfectly flourishing polis. A polis is happy when individuals living within the polis act virtuously under a leadership who himself is virtuous. I'll return to the question of virtue later. For our purpose, let us first consider how some of the philosophers conceive of a happy polis in modern times. Okay. So modernism in Europe, especially Western Europe, is both a cultural as well as an economic phenomena that evolved during the 17th and 18th century. In the political arena, primarily it consisted of the abolition of the monarchy and the feudal systems during the French Revolution and the ushering in of the representative government. On the economic sphere, it was the older mode of production which gave way to industrialization and mass production. Production of things needed for daily existence shifted from the oikos or the household to the market. Happiness in the polis was conceived by philosophers in times of rights and freedoms. The philosophical foundation of these ideas is what is today known as political liberalism and the social contract theory. According to the social contract theory, the foundation of the state is not divinely ordained, but based on contracts entered upon by the free will of rational individuals in order to pursue their own self interest and preserve themselves. Thus, contrary to Aristotle's polis as a natural association of people, social contractarian deemed it as a power established by free rational individuals to protect their self interest. Since the polis, according to political liberalists, is based on the collective rational free will of people, they become the right bearer, which is the individual is the right bearer, having certain inalienable rights, which we cannot strip them of. Let us next see what exactly this means. According to this theory, in a happy polis, individuals have certain inalienable rights. These rights are framed in terms of freedoms that are inalienable and that constitutes the basis of a happy polis. First is the freedom from constraints to choosing one's own ruler or government, and second, the right to property ownership. According to John Locke, one has the natural right to property ownership over the land on which one labored. Together with this, the private individual should have a sphere of privacy outside the gaze of the state where they can exchange goods, choose their families, and practice their faith. The state was considered the public sphere as opposed to this private sphere of the individual. These two were viewed by the liberals as the basic rights of the individual in a happy polis. In this private sphere, quote unquote private, individuals are free to associate, act, exchange ideas and goods. The state will not be guided by religious laws. Nonetheless, individuals can practice their religion in the private sphere. Under this new arrangement, family and market became areas of private spheres. It should be noted here that the right to freedom from constraint in choosing one's political representative and the right to freedom from constraints in owning property are negative rights, as both of them speak about freedom from certain constraints, which was not present during the feudal times. Thus, liberalism viewed as a happy polis, the individual should be free to lead his or her life in the way he or she deems is best for him or her. The state should have minimum control and interference in this private sphere of life of the individual. This was indeed a revolutionary act in times when most people were serfs or slaves and had no voice in the state or the right to own property. Because if someone is a property themselves, how can they own property? To these negative rights, later liberals such as John Stuart Mill added individual liberty as the basic ingredient of a happy society. According to Mill, the most important liberty are freedom from any constraint to free speech, freedom from any constraints to publish and critique an established view, and freedom from any constraint to hold public gatherings. Any society, according to Mill, that has none of these rights, especially the right to free speech, cannot be considered a truly free society, a happy society. Mill's argument is as follows. If a heretic who says something against the majority view is right, then by censoring him, society is losing out. If his view is erroneous, then too society loses out, and without vigorous debate, a society cannot progress. Of course, Mill talks about some limitations to these liberties, which are as follows. A person's liberty is justifiably restricted to prevent the person from harming others, the harm principle. A person's liberty is justifiably restricted to prevent the person from offending others, the offense principle. A person's liberty is justifiably restricted to prevent that person from harming himself or herself, the principle of paternalism. A person's liberty is justifiably restricted to prevent that person from acting immorally, the principle of legal moralism. A person's liberty is justifiably restricted to benefit others, the social welfare principle. So, to summarize, modern liberal philosophers saw a happy polis as a polis where there is a sphere of privacy or of the individual and the state is minimally active in the lives of people. That is the monarchical state. There is no longer any monarchical state, but even the state cannot constrain the people in their private sphere. Further, in this happy polis, all constraint to choosing one's representative in the government and freedom from any constraint to speak what one's conscience permit, that it's free speech, and to publish the same. The fundamental philosophy of political liberalism that deems negative right as the basis of a happy polis formed the foundational principle of the Constitution in the United States, Canada, England, France, and other democratic nations, and was also adopted by nations that evolved from the colonial past in the 20th century. By and large, the notion of political liberalism were negative rights, and the sphere of privacy of the individuals worked to a certain point to give some people the scope to pursue their own desires for happiness. It could not create a happy polis for all citizens. Political liberalism broke the shackles of older feudal systems and brought in a new era of freedom and prosperity in the Western world. In that sense, it did contribute to the good life of many people, to the happy life of many people. The most important critique of political liberalism came from socialist thinkers who said that in order for universal happiness within the polis, the state cannot be inactive in the private lives of citizens. See, the whole idea of political liberalism is the state cannot interfere in the lives of private individuals. For the socialists, that the state, in order for happiness to prevail, the state cannot be inactive in the private lives of individuals. The state has to be proactive in order for citizens to have a good life and to be part of the polis. For this, the socialist thinkers said that in addition to the negative rights, some positive rights have to be incorporated in the newly formed nations which have chosen representative governments. It is not enough, according to socialist thinkers, that people have the freedom from constraint to vote, but also positive rights endowed by the state to have access to nutrition, housing, and health care, without which a good life or a happy polis is not possible. According to socialist thinkers, one cannot have a good life if one does not have access to the basic fundamental necessities and economic deprivation. Further, the socialist question, if there is so much economic inequality, can people really be happy? In addition, socialist thinkers also pointed to the fact that without economic equality, it is not possible to have a good life, and even the negative rights do not work if there is no equality. In order for the polis to be happy, it is not enough that certain people have the freedom from constraint to choosing their government or holding property. For those struggling with property, these rights do not make much sense. People can vote but still can starve. Does the freedom from constraint to owning property have any relevance for those who do not have property in the first place? Does the freedom from constraint to voting have any make any sense for those struggling for food and shelter? Does the freedom of speech have any meaning to those who have no access to education? Hence, in addition to rights, a notion of justice has to be incorporated in the happy polis. Now, the question of a happy polis and good life was formulated in terms of positive rights, not the freedom from, but the right to employment, the right to proper nutrition, the right to housing, the right to health care, all of which form the basis of human well-being and is also the basis of a happy polis. These are not rights that ensure freedom from, but also freedom to have certain entitlements, and it is intimately connected to the notion of well-being and justice. Liberals and social contractarians viewed the role of the state as non-interference of the state and privacy as the basic ingredient of good life, whereas socialists wanted the state to be active in the lives of people in order for a happy polis to happen. Liberals now had to change the notion of their happy polis in order to answer these critiques. So far as they formulated the notion of a happy polis in terms of rights, now they have to consider the question of justice. Rights is not enough. For a happy polis, one has to have justice. These contractarians had to base their contract-based society and state on a sense of justice in order for a happy polis to work in the real world. In the 1970s, with his groundbreaking essay, Original Position, Harvard political philosopher John Rawls gave a new and revised version of the social contract theory that incorporated the notion of justice. Rawls theorized a happy polis where justice would prevail as fairness, not equality, but fairness. In defending a polis based on the free will of rational individuals, Rawls starts with an imaginary original position, according to which parties entering into a contract are only aware that the other party is rational and interested in pursuing the contract. They, however, are under a veil of ignorance, which means that they are ignorant of each other's accidental position, like race, class, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. Under this veil of ignorance, the parties adopt three principles: the principle of greatest liberty consistent with the liberty of others, the principle of equality of opportunity given by all the institutions in society, and the principle of difference, which is highly contested, to which the least privileged will have some special privileges. Rawls also states that one cannot reverse the lexical order, that is, give priority to liberty over equality. The principle of liberty comes first. In order for justice as fairness to work, in addition, according to Rawls, the state has to take active part in the redistribution of goods and services. Thus, the principle of liberty gives people the liberal rights of free speech. The principle of equality of opportunity gives people the positive right to opportunity and employment. The principle of difference brings injustice by catering to the least privileged in an unequal society. Given the three principles, the two and the principle of difference is considered the best considered judgment for rational individuals' collective rational choice under a veil of ignorance. For a happy society, one who has the basic of democracy, basic of free speech, and the basics of equality and the principle of difference. So this is his reworking and answer to the socialist critique of liberalism of the 19th century. Now, if we combine the liberal social contract with some of the state policies introduced by Rawls, because the Rawls doesn't agree with the liberals that the state has to be inactive and non-interfering to the lives of individuals, then we don't have a happy polis. The state has to be actually active in the lives of people. We have a model of the state that is a welfare state. Whereas the state does give the individual to pursue their own happiness, the state is not necessarily inactive in the private lives of citizens. It is proactive and socially includes those who are left out of the social whole. Rawls's three principle is a prototype of a combination of social liberalism and socialism, of positive and negative rights. This model of the welfare state has been the basis of Western government in the 20th century. On the one hand, the state gives its citizen a right to privacy, and the right bearer is the individual. On the other hand, the state is active in the lives of people to bring some positive rights, such as the right to basic economic and health care needs. These two together are viewed as the basis of a happy polis in modern times in the Western world. Next, let us consider the actual application of the welfare democratic system in order to deliver a happy polis for all. Does it work in the West? For our purpose, I'll give two case studies from the US welfare system. The US welfare system is meant for those who are struggling with poverty and social exclusion as a result of their poverty. Lack of education, nutrition, housing, and healthcare. What this does is provide citizens with state aid such as healthcare, Medicaid, food stamps, affordable housing, and free of cost public education and child support. This is primarily used by single mothers in the lower socioeconomic status. It has empowered a lot of women, given them opportunity to be educated and skills, be part of the market system, and opportunity to be socially included. This picture, however, is not so neat. There are many who are moved out of the welfare state and then move back in. So it's not empowering if someone is continuously dependent on the state. It doesn't empower anyone. They were unable to break the cycle of poverty, to be self-sufficient, unemployment and dependent on public charity, had drug abuse problem and a history of domestic violence. It was deemed as a burden on the taxpayers' money. As a result, in the 1990s, a welfare reform was made and a program called Workfare was introduced in the welfare system by Bill Clinton. In this program, people on welfare would work for minimum wages and get out of state-funded welfare and be self-sufficient. does this work? The result was mixed, and it is not viewed as empowering people in poverty. Workfare was not a job or employment. It paid low, and since most single mothers in the United States are on welfare, it was impossible to get any child care or babysitter when the mother is working. Often, instead of empowering the poor, the welfare system put them in a cycle of poverty. In some cases, it actually disempowers those struggling, trying to have a good life. A case is depicted in the famous documentary filmmaker Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine. Tamara, an African American Black woman, was on workfare in the state of Michigan. Her work was that of a server in a small restaurant in a mall, which was 2 hours. She had to take the bus for 2 hours and reach the mall for her workfare program, out of which she thought she'll get out of the welfare system. Tamara was a single mother, had a 6-year-old son, and no babysitter because she couldn't afford and the welfare won't pay. She had to leave the boy with her brother because there was no one to take care of the boy. Tamara's brother owned a gun, which the little boy took to his school and shot another 6-year-old girl in her class. The young girl was dead, and the boy and the mother's life were both ruined. In court, Tamara said that she knew that her brother was not the best person to babysit her little boy, but she had no other choices but to leave the little boy with the brother. This story shows that the state intervention alone for positive rights does not make for a happy polis. In addition, there have been cases of drug abuse and child abuse by many mothers. In addition, there have been reports of people not using state funding properly to get financial aid. The state-sponsored welfare and handouts, Medicare, housing are all empowerment for a happy polis, but they're not enough to empower people or put them out of the cycle of poverty to become fully flourishing member of the polis. Neither do they create an equal society. There has been reports of success of individuals who have used the welfare system, pulled themselves out of poverty, and have been contributing members of society. There are also stories of individuals, like I said with Tamara, the Black woman, single mother, who was in poverty and now in prison because she couldn't take care of the child who actually killed the girl in her class. And there are other stories who have misused the scheme from the taxpayers' money and have abused drugs, failed to maintain standard grades in the free education system and the free housing in a way, and use the free housing in a way that is not legal. Apart from the above, often welfare recipients are not treated with dignity. Women on welfare have to give the state employer all her case history about her sexuality and the paternity of her children. If she has 3 children, she has to go through, giving the paternity of each child. In addition, as sociologist Nancy Fraser points out, the system constructs citizens as possessive individuals if they can work and as charity recipients if they're on welfare, and that's very undignified. The social image of a charity recipient dependent on public largesse is neither empowering nor conducive to a happy polis or a good life. Living without dignity and on welfare for some does not necessarily lead to a free society. The welfare capitalist system did not exactly solve the problem of a happy polis or gave universal right to happiness. This does not mean that the modern welfare system did not achieve success to bring many people within a nation out of poverty and make them socially inclusive. The above theories overtly depend on the state negatively or positively to bring in happiness. Amartya Sen, who agrees with Rawls's theory of justice as fairness and the social contract, nonetheless is critical of the principle of difference. What is the principle of difference? According to Rawls, under the veil of ignorance, the liberal should adopt 3 principles: the principle of liberty, the principle of equality of opportunity, not equality. Liberty also is not absolute liberty, but maximum liberty consistent with the liberty of the others. I have the liberty to use the public roads. I have no liberty to crash into someone else. According to Rawls's principle of difference, those who are least privileged will have some special privileges. That is the last principle, the principle of difference. And Rawls says, under the veil of ignorance, these three principles are what we choose, rationally choose for a happy polis. The best rational judgment for rational individuals collectively to choose. Who will decide who is less privileged? Amartya Sen asks that. For Rawls, it is the state. According to Sen, the needs of people are too diverse, and the state cannot make a blanket decision about who needs what. Maybe someone has one child, and that person needs a little bit less than someone who has three children, and they need a little bit more Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. Instead of Rawls's social contract theory, Sen brings in the theory of capabilities. In his article, Equality of What, Sen talks about three different types of equalities. One, the utilitarian notion of equality that talks of equality in terms of total aggregate. The marginal equality where one has the most, but it all adds up to an aggregate. Apart from the utilitarian theory of equality, there is also the Rawlsian theory of equality, which, as we saw above, is tied to fairness. Rawls never said that a happy polis, everyone has to be equal. He said there should be fair, everyone should have a fair chance. According to Rawlsian theory, most just systems is that which is fair. In order for this to happen, rational individuals do the three principles under a veil of ignorance, where they do not have any information about each other's identity or social location. Under the veil of ignorance, they choose the principle of maximum liberty, principle of equality, and principle of difference. The state, according to Rawls, has to take a proactive stand in the redistribution of goods and services, which we saw with the welfare system in the West. It doesn't work really to empower people in many cases. For Sen, both the utilitarian and the Rawlsian theories are problematic. As the former, the utilitarian theory, the maximum happiness of people, takes only the aggregate principle and not the distribution of resources, because we all have different needs. We are diverse. And the latter does not take into account the diversity of people's need and their decision-making power. In his article, Capabilities and Well-Being, Sen talks about well-being of people in terms of their functioning and capabilities. A good society is where one can function in a way that is conducive to their well-being. One can function to make decisions about the lives that they think are best. Functioning is not necessarily tied to how much pleasure or goods one has at one's disposal. One can have a lot of goods at one's disposal, but doesn't mean they're happy. As utilitarians or Rawls would suggest, how much capability one has to make a decision about their lives. A fully functional human being cannot live in an impoverished society or lack education and healthcare. One cannot focus on the goods, but what they mean for the functioning of the individual, such as the individual can lead a life that he or she desires. Now, how many of us have the capability to make those decisions? Philosopher Martha Nussbaum talks about capabilities of Sen as basic entitlements. What kind of entitlements one must have in order to function in a society that is conducive to one's idea of a good life? Even when a society has goods and services at its disposal, because of social discrimination or learned behavior, one cannot access them, hence use them for oneself to build a life that one desires. Nussbaum gives a list of things that should be available for people's well-being. They're both negative rights, such as freedom from constraint, to right to choosing one's government, freedom in the political sphere, to practice religion. Positive rights like freedom from hunger, freedom from homelessness, freedom from lack of education, and access to the legal machinery of a society. According to Nussbaum, the capability approach caters to the diversity of people's needs and lets people make decisions about their own lives, and hence an improvement over Rawls's theory of the state redistributing resources. The question still remains: who decides what is the level of need for diverse group of population to function? Who decides what is going to measure the capabilities of individual and the needs thereof? The state? If so, the state has to be proactive regardless of what Sen says. One of Sen's critique of Rawls was that the state should cannot decide the individual needs, but here the diversities is in capabilities. The same problems arise. How much capable can one be to make a decision for one's life that will make a good life? So sense theory, although significant, has some problems too. All the above theories talk of the notion of the state as the sole empowerment for people, positive or negative. We saw about in the above case that despite state policies, these policies have empowered some but failed to empower some also. And if so, then can the state alone create a happy polis? What is the role of the individual now in creating the happy polis? If we look deeply into Aristotle's theory of the happy polis, then we see that for Aristotle, a happy polis is that where each individual acts virtuously and in total the happy polis is created. For Aristotle, the role of the individual is foremost in making a happy polis. This is something neither the natural rights theorists nor the socialists talk about. Let us next consider some theorists for whom morality stands with the individual and not structural issues. In this context, let us talk about Immanuel Kant and how we can make virtuous individuals for a happy polis. According Kant was a deontologist. Deontology is a Greek word meaning duty. According to deontological theory, the morality of an action has to be determined by whether or not it's done from a sense of duty, regardless of its consequences. According to Kant, wealth, power, honor are all good, but only extrinsically good or good for something else. The only thing that is good in itself is the goodwill. In Kant's word, a goodwill is that which shines by its own light. It encompasses duty. In other words, one does a duty for duty's sake, regardless of the consequence of that action. In Kantian moral theory, there are four basic duties: absolute duty to self and others, non absolute duty to self and others. According to Kant, absolute duty to self is always to preserve oneself, never commit suicide, and never break promise. The two non absolute duties are to improve one's talents and help others when needed. According to Kant, not all times all human beings are bound by these four duties. Kant says that every action that we do has a maxim or a reason. For example, suppose S lies to Y. There must be a maxim or a reason why S is lying to Y, maybe to cater his own self-interest. Using Kant's terminology, we can test if this is a moral act. His test is to universalize the reason for someone's action. In this case, can we universalize S's motivation of lying for self-interest? No, we cannot, because we don't want people to lie to each other all the time, because then the fabric of society is going to fall apart. So we cannot universalize lying as a moral act. Further, we do not want anyone to lie to us, which means we are making an exception and hence cannot universalize it and make it into a law. Since we cannot universalize the act of lying or deceiving, we cannot make it into a law in the Kantian test. So when S lies to Y, they are breaking what Kant would call the categorical imperative or the absolute command, do not lie. Or act on the principle such that you can universalize your reason to act to a general law. Every time you cannot make what you do universal for everyone. If you're cheating on the taxes, then do you endorse everyone's cheating on the taxes? No one will do that because society won't run, which means your action is immoral because you couldn't universalize it. The second imperative or command of Kant is the practical imperative: never treat a human being as a means, but always as an end. Thus, by lying or deceiving, is actually using someone as a means. A person who uses state funds and then refuses to enhance his skills, thus breaks the non-absolute duty of Kant. They are failing to improve their talents. The reason why Kant's theory of the individual is important, because it stresses on the free will of the individual and not merely the state. When a person avoids his or her responsibility and denies complete free will and social responsibility, a happy polis, regardless of how many social welfare schemes there are, is never going to be happy. A person on welfare who chooses to avoid his or her own social responsibility is breaking the categorical imperative and also the duty of breaking promise towards society and his or her fellow beings. The state can give a lot of schemes to the individual, but the individual may not be using them, blaming their drug abuse on their childhood trauma or social exclusion. While the latter may be true, but as Kant says, the role of the free will is always there. This is also what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. The notion of freedom of choice is the central theme of Sartre's theory of bad faith. According to Sartre, there are two types of deceptions. One where the deceiver and the deceived are two different people. The deceiver escapes the situation, transcends, and looks down on the person he has deceived. He's in cynical consciousness. As opposed to that, Sartre talks about bad faith, where the deceiver and the deceived are the same. There is no transcendental consciousness. There's no split between the deceiver and the deceived. For example, a person may be blaming his circumstances and the government for his condition. In doing so, according to Sartre, he's living in bad faith, for he always had the freedom of choice to act whatever his situations were. Man is always free to choose, and in fact, according to Sartre, condemned to be free. He's not bound by anything. When he gives up his freedom and starts justifying his action, he's living in bad faith, or what Sartre called inauthentic existence. He lies and deceives himself and is in inauthentic existence, as in the case of Y, who uses the state funding not to self-improve. This is where he gives up his infinite possibility of being a subject and tells himself that because of his circumstances, he's using his state funding to abuse drugs. We choose at every moment and cannot deny our responsibility when we act in a way where we say we have no choice. In Kierkegaard's work, we see Abraham being may had a terrible choice. Either he would sacrifice, this is from the Old Testament, sacrifice his son Isaac or disobey God's command. And Abraham was the original of the monotheistic religion. Kierkegaard says this: we face these dilemmas and these choices, moral choices, or every moment of our life. In making choices not to do drugs, not to abuse state and public fundings, one makes these choices to lead a life of inauthentic existence. No amount of public and state sponsored program can justify a person making bad choices in his or her life. Having dealt with two of these thinkers, we now see clearly what Aristotle's intention was. Aristotle, as we saw above, clearly said that a happy polis is where each individual is virtuous. For Aristotle, everything has an end or moving towards an excellence, and the excellence of the human being is to be the best human being, which is to be a virtuous human being. What is virtue? According to Aristotle, virtues are not natural, like passions or anger. They are born characters that have to be cultivated in a flourishing polis under a virtuous leadership. A person is virtuous if he or she can determine and act according to the means between excess and deficiency. For example, rashness and cowardice are two extremes. Bravery is a mean and a virtue, according to Aristotle. Again, while overspending and miserliness are two extremes, being thrifty is a mean. Drinking exact amount is a virtue, being drunkenness and abstinence. Politeness is a virtue, between flattering and borishness. Proper pride is a virtue, a balance between flattering and borishness. A virtuous person is brave, thrifty, restrained, polite, proud, modest, and witty. Let us apply this to the above case. The virtuous thing for S is to get into therapy when she is doing drugs, talk of his own childhood memories instead of abusing the system and doing drugs and using public funding, which is why the welfare system really didn't work well in the West, and or use cocaine during pregnancy. Of course, it would need free will, determination, the courage to face one's choices and responsibilities. The role of the state, as Amartya Sen says, is to enhance the capabilities via providing universal access to healthcare and education and nutrition, so forth. This does not mean that once capabilities are enhanced, that the state will go on providing healthcare or handouts. The autonomous, rational individual has a role which is to act virtuously, and I define what virtue is. The aim of the polis, as Aristotle says, is eudaimonia, which loosely translated is happiness for all. Because if any of us are miserable, everyone's miserable. Because we are a human community. Happiness for all can only be achieved if individuals act virtuously. And as we saw above, virtue is a balance between excess and deficiency. The concept of virtue is central to Indic philosophies, Buddhism, Jainism, Vedic religions, and so forth. The term is dharma, which is the root word is three, that is to sustain. One can act virtuously in a dharmic way only if one can balance between contenting stakes without the consideration to self interest or with bad intentions. This is very well articulated in the Eastern healing art or the practice of healthcare, both in the Ayurvedic and the Tibetan medicine, from what I understand, and partially Chinese medicine. While healing comes from the outside, one also has to practice certain behavior in order to lead a healthy life. A patient whose family has a history of diabetes is prone to diabetes, and if one can give him proper medication, which is coming from outside, but it is also true that he has to have a free will to practice a healthy life and avoid food that is unhealthy for him. His lifestyle, the disease can also affect him. From what I understand, this balancing act is a virtuous or a dharmic act that will provide virtuous individuals and turn into a happy polis. This requires concerted effort by the state, society, public workers, family educators, intellectuals to make a society filled with virtuous people and a virtuous leader. The task is complex and difficult, but with concerted effort and by adopting the best practices, we can hope to reach a long-lasting solutions. Thank you very much.
ম্যাম কিছু প্রশ্ন আছে, আপনি বললে আমি কোয়েশ্চেনগুলো এক এক করে নিয়ে নেব।
Yes.
ওকে, ফার্স্ট কোয়েশ্চেন প্রকাশ চক্রবর্তী, what is the contribution of Aristotle in politics?
Aristotle in politics, as far as activism is concerned, তো কতটা ছিল আমি জানি না. He was never part of the actual political system, but his politics, the book, is still read as one of the foundational texts in political science, philosophy, and so forth. তো যদি academics বা লেখাটা যদি activism হয় তাহলে his contribution is huge, but he was never part of the system in Athens, the actual political system in Athens.
Okay, ma'am. Next question is from Manabesh Roy. What is original position, veil of ignorance and justice as fairness according to Rawls? Please explain with example, ma'am.
Very good. So when the liberals of the 19th century, they were all talking about freedom from constraint because they were fighting against monarchy. We all fight according to the oppression of our times. We don't fight some other times. We live through history. They were very focused on the freedom from constraint to not having the right to vote, not having the right to ownership of property. But what the socialist thinkers, specifically Marx, showed that just because the state is a representative state, or because the parliament has passed the right to property ownership, does not mean that everyone has the right to property. Because if you don't have property, what are you going to own? It was definitely a move forward because now you don't have slavery or serfdom anymore. People are free. They are not constrained under their master, but did not, make everyone happy because there are lots of people who had no property. So if you don't have property, there's no question of property rights. And if you're poor and struggling, you really don't care whether you have the right to choose your own government or not, which is actually not true. I still think people they want, whether one is suffering from poverty or not, people have the desire to be free to choose their own government. No one wants to be either under a theocracy or a dictatorship or a monarchy. Now, Rawls brought in the question of, he re-established liberalism from the critique of the socialist, and particularly Marx, who showed that representative democracy does not bring inequality. So the original contractarians were, they imagined that society was not based on divine command, because that's how the monarchs ruled, right? In Europe, if you look at the French system and so forth, it was based on a contract made by individuals amongst themselves. And Marx showed that that contract really doesn't make sense, because most people were not part of the contract. People who had no property, women were never part of that contract, slaves were never part of that contract. So the contract theory was very much criticized by Marx. Now, Rawls says that the contract theory will work only if we assume something. That is, the people we are entering into a contract, we are absolutely unbiased about their social identities. We don't know their race, their class, their ethnicity, religion, none of these accidental features, as he calls them. We only know that they are rational and they want to sign the contract and pursue their own self-interest. This is his veil of ignorance. This is his original position. And from that position, if we imagine, I mean, the whole thing is a thought experiment. No one actually signed a contract. But if we consider the other, stripped of all their accidental features like their race, class, ethnicity, those identities that evolve in society, then we will adopt three principles which will cater to justice as fairness. No one is talking about justice as equality. That dream of the 19th century, Rousseau and so forth, that's gone. Then we adopt three principles: principle of maximum liberty consistent with the liberty of the others, principle of equality of opportunity given by the state and the officers, and the principle of difference where the least privilege will have some special privileges. So his original position is a thought experiment where people are signing contract to establish a state, but it is a position of absolute unbiasedness. See, whenever we sign a contract, we tend to be a little biased with the other person's, accidental features, race, class, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. But if we have no knowledge about these features, then the original position is an absolute unbiased position. It's a really ideal position. From that position, we adopt these three principles. He calls them the best considered judgment, rational judgment under the veil of ignorance. And then we can have a society that's really fair. So that is his theory of the original position on justice as fairness.
Ma'am, next question is also from Manvesh Roy. Um Question is, today democracy is the best form of government, but Aristotle said that democracy is the corrupt form of government. Why?
First of all, during Aristotle, remember Aristotle, when I started this presentation, I talked about how Aristotle divided space into the public and the private. And Aristotle's polis, not everyone participated, only free rational males, those who had education. In Aristotle's time, women and slaves, because the oikos was formed. Who are the inhabitants of the oikos? Slaves and women and children. They had no access to education. And so they were not participatory in democracy. So his concept of democracy and our concept of democracy is different. So that's one thing, that a lot more people are in the participatory democracy. Now, what he said about any government, any system degenerating is still true today. We consider people's choices to choose their representative to rule them as the best form of government. People have voices, but we have a lot more people who probably can make some rational choices about who would be best to rule them. That's why we think that democracy is the best form of government. That was, first of all, not true during Aristotle. Most people were not educated. Secondly, I think his next thing, his whole point is that's why only the elites, which is Plato's ideal state, will be ruled by the 12 philosopher kings, because most people are not worthy of ruling themselves because they don't know what's good for them. That's why only the elites will rule. Whether it's still true today, we don't know. But one thing still holds is any system will become very corrupt over a period of time. But what's good in democracy ultimately is if you have a free speech, which is what Mill is saying in his liberalism, and critique, then however bad the system is, there's still going to be an alternative voice and a critique, because no system is perfect. But Aristotle's democracy and ours slightly different. I mean, Martha Nussbaum and Sen, they use the happy polis, especially Martha Nussbaum, the happy polis, but our polis is very different from his, because most adults who are legal citizens can participate in choosing their own state, but that was not true in Aristotle.
Next question, ma'am. Next question is from Ilora Sharkar. What is reflexive equilibrium, madam?
Okay, yes, this is the more the economic concept, right? It is the concept of the Malthusian concept that, when there is equilibrium in society, it's when, more or less there is all the economic, the market, from what I understand. I don't know if I'm right in this. There is the general happy polis will happen when there is constant, which is, problem. Malthus said that then when food production is at equilibrium with population, then there is happiness. And when there is disequilibrium, whether in this system and that, then society is going to be unhappy. But this whole concept of the equilibrium or flexibility, it's it's a dream of the 19th century, that the whole concept of everything has to be balanced. Probably it's coming from that Aristotelian, the virtue is, which is actually a good idea, but how far that is going to work in society, we don't know. That is my understanding. You can do your own reading on that.
Ma'am, next question is from Manavesh Roy. According to Aristotle, monarchy is the best form of government, and polity is the best practicable form of government. Please explain about both statements.
Aristotle was a student of Plato. So when you see, he will not want democracy, because this is, he says this very clearly. Why are women and slaves confined to the oikos and not allowed in the public sphere? And he gives a very evolutionary kind of explanation. He says Greek women have confused rationality, but they have a function in society to reproduce the Greek society, the Greek species. Because remember, the Greek society thrived on war, especially with Sparta. So they needed a lot of male children, so to reproduce the Greek species. And the slaves also have a function, is to do manual labor. Now, the amount of manual labor they needed, we don't need that, because we have technology now. Much of the work that the slaves did, our technology does. That's one thing. So in okay, let me ask back this question. In a society where 90% is not educated, do you think all of them should participate, or not? Let's, for a minute, I think everyone's rational, but that's, and everyone knows what's good for them, but for a minute try to think that people are not very rational. Then is it better that everyone will make a decision, or one person who is a little bit more rational, can see the future, will make a decision? That's why probably he says monarchy is the best form of government, because again, see, his monarchy, Aristotle's monarchy, and Plato's theory of the 12 philosopher kings in his republic is not the same as the European monarchy. The European monarchy was most based on power, not that they were intellectually superior to the others, but that was not the Greek system. The European system is not the same as the Greek. The Plato very clearly says in his Republic, these are very knowledgeable philosopher kings, 12 philosopher kings who would not own private property. They will never get married. They will not have inheritors. They will completely devote their life to the good welfare of the whole, the state. And they are the most educated. And they will control the state. I think Plato's republic is more like what a communist society with the elite at the helm, Leninist society, would be, rather than the European monarchical system. So let's not confuse the two. The European monarchical system is hereditary. They're not necessarily the most educated. I mean, Louis XVI was not the most educated person during the French Revolution. I mean, Rousseau and Voltaire were much more educated than him, but they were not part of the state. So in that sense, he's saying that it is the best form of government where most people are not educated. That Amartya Sen's whole thing is. Empowerment comes, individuals have to make decisions about their lives. But where are these individuals? At what level are they? What level are their rationality? What level are their education? That's why for him it's capabilities rather than the state redistributing. I mean, we do need the state helping people who are, the lower end. That's what the US welfare system is. And we saw all these problems. Single mothers, not having any babysitter or childcare or anything, that the little boy takes a gun and shoots a classmate in his class. So the state redistribution of wealth only is not going to help citizens. It's the individual empowerment, and that's Sen's whole theory of capabilities. And Martha Nussbaum, she goes one step further than Sen, and she says that capabilities are fundamental entitlements, which is education, which in the Aristotelian society and also in the French society, most people were not given education. In Aristotle clearly said that slaves cannot have education, and women and slaves cannot have education. Same in European society. But European monarchy is not the same as the way the Greeks conceived of monarchy. It's a little bit different. And some people will say actually both Aristotle and especially Plato's ideal republic is very progressive. It's exactly like the Leninist system of the intellectuals, the Communist Party controlling everyone else because people can't make decisions about themselves because most people are not educated. And the least in practice and the politics least practical form of government. Well, what do you guys think? Is democracy practical or is it practicable when most people do not know how to make their decisions? There are a huge number of uneducated people. There's a lot of violence. Does it work? I don't know how to answer that.
We are
Does
going
democracy? Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
next is from Anubesh Roy also. What is lexical order according to Rawls?
The lexical order is, remember, under the veil of ignorance, he says the rational individual has three principles they adopt. They choose three principles which they consider the best possible, rational principles for justice as fairness to work. First is principle of greatest liberty, consistent with the liberty of the others. And my example is I can use the public roads, but I can't crash my car into someone else. Second is principle of equality of opportunity, given by all institutions. No one's going to be discriminated because of their gender, because of their class, because of their race, and so forth. And the third is the principle of difference, where the state gives some additional, like the welfare system, handouts. I don't like that word, but I'm using it because I can't think of anything else. The lexical order is according to Rawls, and this is very interesting. The liberty comes before equality. So he says we cannot trade more equality for less liberty. This is actually what Amartya Sen takes up. He compares India and China during famine, and he said India controlled famine better because there's still a free speech, there's still liberty. Although China has probably more equality, but they made a disaster. Why? Because in dictatorship under Mao Zedong, he was lied to. There's no free media. And when there is a disaster, free speech always comes first, not equality. Even when, say, North Korea, maybe in North Korea people are more equal than they are in India or the United States, but still both Rawls and Sen, they will agree that free speech comes before. Liberty is, as a value, will be chosen by rational individuals over equality. What do you guys think? I mean, this is a question. I prefer liberty. I prefer freedom of speech over equality. I would rather be poor than not have free speech. Not North Korea in the way, or a theocratic state. Theocratic states, they don't have freedom of speech. So that's the lexical order that he's talking about.
থ্যাংক ইউ ম্যাম, থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ। কত প্রশ্ন এসেছে আজকে, তো এত ধৈর্য ধরে এতগুলো প্রশ্নের উত্তর দেওয়ার জন্য থ্যাংক ইউ। এবং আমরা চাইবো যে, আমরা আশাও রাখবো যে আপনি আবার অন্য একটা বিষয় নিয়ে অন্য একটা সময় আসবেন আমাদের কাছে। আমাদের ছাত্রছাত্রী বা দর্শকের এতে সত্যি খুবই উপকার হবে। এবং সত্যি এটা একটু জটিল টপিক, এটা এতক্ষণ ধরে আপনি বুঝিয়ে বুঝিয়ে বলেছেন, সত্যি।
আর এটা তো আমি স্ক্র্যাচ করলাম, আই জাস্ট স্ক্র্যাচ দ্য সারফেস, এটা অনেক ডিপ, এতটুকু সময় আই জাস্ট স্ক্র্যাচ দ্য সারফেস।
তো
থ্যাংক ইউ
সো মাচ, থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ,
ওকে,
থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ। ভালো থাকবেন সবাই, সুস্থ
সবাই
থাকবেন।
ভালো থাকে। হ্যাঁ,
হ্যাঁ,
ওকে,
শুভরাত্রি।
বাই বাই, বাই বাই।